Welcome, everybody. I think we're having people starting to slowly join us. So we'll give a couple seconds before we start our introduction. Just to let you know, if you haven't seen Impathables, there is a copy of the PowerPoint listed in there if you want to look at it. And there's also a version of handouts. We have had a request to change the handout. So after the session, I'll be turning it into 2 PowerPoint slides per screen. So if you want to wait to print something out until after that, then you might want to wait maybe 30 minutes or so, and I'll try to get it uploaded. So if you're just joining us, I'm going to give probably 30 more seconds before we get started. I see a lot of people still filtering in. I want to make sure that we have most of the people in the room before we actually get started. It looks like the participants have slowed down, so why don't we get started with our session today? Welcome for joining us. We are session B2, discussing race, racism, and current events regarding race with students and staff. My name is Stephanie Martinez. I am a technical assistant specialist at the University of South Florida on the Florida Pbis project. Tamika, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tamika LaSalle, Associate Professor at the University of Connecticut in the School Psychology program.
Thank you. Ruthie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. I am Ruthie Painel-Simmons, and I am with the MIMTS-STA Center in Michigan, and it's good to be here today.
Thank you. And our exemplar for today, Naomi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Naomi Brahim. I am in charge of multi-tiered systems of support in Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky.
Thank you. So just a couple slides to get started. Just a reminder, Brian went over these already this morning in the opening session, but these are our expectations for the virtual forum for being responsible, respectful, and safe. So if you just want to refer to those. We're hoping that you're finding your way through Pathables. You've made it into the session. That's a really good start. So awesome there. Navigating through the session page, you've probably seen this probably your 3rd time now, but this is just how to get into the different session pages and to find things like the files and the chat and the polls. I know that we have Dr. Kent McIntosh, who is monitoring the polls for us. We don't have any polls for the session, but if you've got questions or comments, that's where you can put that, and he will be reaching out to us for those throughout the session. So again, here's just some more tips on how to use those features. Just be careful if you're clicking around in Pathables, it's easy to get out of the session. So here's some directions just to get back. I think for me, the easiest one is to go to Agenda, My Agenda, and then you can click on the session and it will bring you back in. And if you are having any technical assistance problems, so any tech issues that you need help, there's this help desk on Pathables that can help you resolve some of those. And finally, we know that for the forum, the way the forum's been set up for many years now is the recommendation is teams come to the training, to the virtual forum, and then the teams kind of divide and conquer the different sessions to attend. So if you have a group of individuals from your school, your district, or your state who have come and are doing that, here's just some 5 questions to consider as we go through the content today to bring back to your team to share what you have learned. And with that, we're going to actually dive into the content for today. We have 2 main things that we're going to be covering is both a review of the new guide that's come out about talking about race, racism with students and staff. And then we have our exemplar, who is going to be highlighting some things that Jefferson County Public Schools has been doing around this topic. You're probably here to hear about what Naomi and Jefferson County Public Schools have been doing. She's got some great wealth of knowledge and resources that she's going to share with you today. She's going to tell you how to find all of those. Jefferson County Public Schools, the team that's worked on these resources, is willing to share, and you can get access to most of them on the district website. She's got hyperlinks. But the one thing I just want to share about what Jefferson County is doing is that this is a work in progress. So they are an exemplar, and that is the reason she's here today representing the team from Jefferson County Public Schools. So we just want to stress, as you're listening to her, you might get a little overwhelmed and think, we're not even anywhere near this. How can we be like this? Start where you need to start. It's been many years that they've been working on this. It's not been an overnight thing. It's been 3 or 4 years that they've worked to get these systems in place, and they're continuing to modify and work towards it. So just a reminder, take a deep breath as you're listening to Naomi and just pick 1 or 2 things, maybe even 3 or 4, that as she's talking that you think, yeah, we could do this. Everybody has to start somewhere. And so this has been a work in progress for them. So as I mentioned, we'll be covering the guide about discussing race, racism, and important current events with students. Now, this was a team effort to put this guide together. So I don't want to take credit from all of us, but I want you to really focus on all the individuals on this screen that helped to develop this guide. We're going to really be diving into it about what it is, what it encompasses, but just realize giving credit for all these wonderful people who spent a lot of time and energy and effort putting this together. And there will be a hyperlink on the PowerPoint to get to the guide. It is on the Center on Pbis page, and I believe Kent is also going to be putting the link to the guide in the Pathables chat feature area. So what we're going to spend most of our time today doing is kind of reviewing the different content that you can find in this guide. And so it's broken down into 3 different sections. First, we have the introduction. Then we'll go into how to embed this work in existing systems. And that's key and critical, is how do we build it into something that we're already doing? Then we'll go into building your own knowledge and experiences so you can build that in you before you actually start to have the conversations with others. Then creating an installation plan. And as always, we want to go back and implement and then monitor the progress. So how do we know it's working? What are our data indicating that we're seeing a difference? And then of course, last but not least, we have an appendix. The appendix is chock full of different resources and documents for implementation, sample lesson plans, sample websites. So lots of great different resources kind of help to get you started with having these discussions. And we'll go more in depth onto each one of these areas. And we'll also have Naomi share some examples of what Jefferson County has done for all of these. So first, within the introduction to the guide, here's just the 5 topics that are covered in that introduction. We give you the purpose behind it, and then the rationale for why this guide was developed. Then we talk about how to use the guide and really identifying that there are multiple entry points for you to start looking at having these conversations. So it's tailored towards district teams, school teams, and even some examples if you're a single teacher at your school, some different things that you can do and what foundation you need to have to start to have these conversations. Within this, we really want to make sure that there is a process for really deeply implementing these practices. And so we go back to Fixon et al. And look at what are those things that we need to do to really make this implementation sustained and over time implementing these practices within our schools, our school districts, and with our students. So we're going to go through these 4 different processes in a little bit. I'll turn it over to Naomi to talk about a little bit about Jefferson County and what they look like.
So as the exemplar, let me introduce you to my school district. Jefferson County is the largest school district in Kentucky. It's the 27th largest school district in the US, We have 173 school settings. Our total student enrollment is over 95,000, and our white student population is about 39%. Black student population is about 37%. And we have about 70% of our students on free and reduced lunch. Our teacher population is at 6,000. So we have 6,000 teachers in our district, and 2/3 of our students ride a school bus to or from school each day. We have 3 district-wide focus areas as set by our board and superintendent: culture and climate, the backpack of success skills, and racial equity. We're going to talk about the racial equity pillar today. So I want to take a moment to highlight our diversity, equity, and poverty department, because most of the racial equity resources that I will reference during this presentation was created by them. In our district, we have a chief of diversity, equity, and poverty, and his team focuses on racial equity. And they also focus on other initiatives related to equity and inclusion. We partner with the DEP team on a continual basis just to ensure that our work is not seen as one more thing, but is constantly interwoven in the thread of the day-to-day operations of schools. So what you see in front of you is the DEP curriculum vitae. It just showcases their initiatives and highlights some of the racial equity work happening in my district. The great news, as you heard Stephanie talk about, is there are links throughout the presentation. And so the curriculum vitae is linked here. So if it's turquoise or if it's dark blue and it's underlined, that means it's a link. And so feel free to go back and review the resources. I work in the culture and climate department, and we focus on student, teacher, and family supports through the lens of MTSS, both academic and behavior, trauma-informed care, bullying prevention, and other resources and family supports. So I'm sure that some of my JCPS colleagues are participating in this session, so big shout out to them. So I am from Louisville, Kentucky, home of Muhammad Ali, the Kentucky Derby, and yes, Breonna Taylor. Last year, while our students and families were at home learning how to do school virtually, they were also witnessing and living through the trauma of dealing with racial injustice in their hometown, as well as everyone else across the nation. Because of both the COVID and racial equity pandemics, last fall, we held several focus groups with students and with educators on racial equity, racial trauma, and racial justice. Here are just a few of their voices.
I think there's a lot of people that just like don't want to come to terms with it. And you know, people don't like change and they don't like doing anything to make an impact on something. And it's like, yeah, you can admit this is happening, but it's your actions have to back up your words in this situation. And I know a lot of people that are like, yeah, racism exists, but what can I do? Like, I'm just one person, but we have to go at this situation as a group. And it's not something that we can just ignore, which is like our biggest problem, is getting through to people who just want to choose to ignore it and just sit back.
I know that the school that I go to is very open to having those open conversations about problems and certain events in our city, but I also have other friends who might go to places that like to push it under the rug and don't like to talk about it, and because they're concerned about like conflict in the classroom or some things like that. And I think it's important to talk about that in school. And with talking about that, you can pull so many different narratives and perspectives from different people who have different experiences. And I think that helps a lot, instead of just being like, okay, school is strictly for what's in this book, nothing else. We're not going to talk about anything else. That just confuses kids even more when they get to that point where they're being exposed to things that aren't in those books. You know what I mean?
Thankfully, I had a couple teachers, like after the announcement of like the decision of the local investigation of the Breonna Taylor case, they allowed us to to talk about in class. And like, I only had one teacher do that. But all of my other teachers are kind of like moving on. And it's like, I don't know if they're trying to, because it is traumatizing for like people of color and Black people to have to retell or relive whatever story or experience of oppression or traumatic event they experienced. It is traumatizing to have to like constantly retell that story. But when you're not given the space to at least talk about it once, then you're bottling it up and you don't tell anybody how you're feeling, and all of a sudden it's like you break down. And I was able to, thankfully in my theater class, my teacher gave me the space to express what I was feeling, and like I felt a little better that I was able to get it off my chest, because all the rest of my classes of that day, that was my last class of the day, the rest of my classes didn't say a single word about it, and I wasn't sure how I felt. But I'm thankful that I go to a school that there are people that are open to the conversation, and there are teachers that care, and it's an environment that we can all talk about it without necessarily having to worry about backlash, I guess.
You can play this one, Stephanie.
And I think what you said about the comfort level is also really important, because as a white educator, a Black student may not want to talk about their racial trauma with me because I represent the oppressor. And so I think as educators, we have to acknowledge that and give a safe space for that. So it's not forcing kids to talk about it if they don't want to, because they may not feel safe discussing it with me. Right. And that's okay. Having to say, you don't have to discuss this with me, just like your boys may not want to discuss that, and it's okay. But I want to lay it out there for you just in case you do.
I think the students want to talk, but it has to be a comfortable space where they feel, comfortable and safe, psychologically safe enough to have that conversation. And so when I talk to the staff, I tell them it's not your turn to talk. let our students share. It's a lot going on right now, right? Just in Louisville, it's a lot going on. And I think some of our students don't feel safe enough to talk to the educator that's in front of them. And that's very important, because if you don't feel connected to the teacher, you're not going to feel comfortable with that teacher, right? And so I think, I know they want to talk. I know they want to have that discussion. But one, I feel like some of them are not comfortable. And two, some of our educators already come with their own opinions to the screen. Yeah. They come with their own opinions. So I think it's, one of those, should I say something? Can I say something without him or her having that opinion or that, aggression towards me?
You have to be open too, I think, sometimes to put content down. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you got to be willing to put content to the side to feel like what's going on with the world.
Yes.
I even remember when Breonna Taylor's The Decision came out. I put content. I don't care. Mm-hmm. Like, colonial America ain't going nowhere. Mm-hmm. I'm 8th grade social studies. It'll be there when I get back. But this is right now.
Yeah.
And I need to deal with right now, because if I'm affected by it, I can only imagine what they are. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, content will always be there. And I think sometimes as educators, we're so worried about making sure we get through the unit, and I got to assess this, and K-prep's coming up and we got to prepare them for this. But content will always be there. This moment may not always be there. And you have to capitalize on those moments and turn them into movements.
Thank you, Naomi, for those 2 videos. I think they're very powerful and set the tone for the why for this guide that students and teachers need and want to talk about the current events that are happening. And so good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for being a part of our session today. All the things that I'm going to talk about are actually in the discussion or the Discussing Race guide. I intentionally aligned my talking points with the language in the guide so that it can support building fluency as you listen today, but also as you move into using the guide if you haven't already. And as Stephanie mentioned, there are 4 components to this recursive process. And so we're going to start with the first part of that, and that's embedding within existing systems. The guide provides 4 ways to embed discussing race within existing systems. We can move to the next slide. Thank you so much. So we want to situate this work in an existing team. We want to bring others onto the team. We want to critically examine the systems we already have in place. And we also want to partner with administrators and families and school boards. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what those will look like. So when we talk about situating this work in an existing team, one of the first recommendations that the guide makes is not to go it alone. And even students were saying in the video, this is not something to go it alone, because teaching and discussing race-related topics can really bring up discomfort, a whole slew of emotions, and even resistance. So working within a team structure allows individuals to learn together as a community, which is a critical part of this work, to pilot and get feedback on ideas and lean on the influence and backing of the team to support the work that's going forward. We want to be able to serve as critical friends to one another as we're engaging in this work. And so your teams can situate this work in existing teams by leveraging existing teams. It's important when you're doing that to consider utilizing current teams and work groups instead of creating new teams. You can ask questions such as, are there existing teams that would be willing to make discussions about race a priority? And if it's the case, and you can say yes to that, then you can think about using those teams rather than doing things that would create silos or fragment the work. Common teams for this work could include your district Pbis teams, your climate and wellness teams, your equity teams, as well as your professional learning communities, your PLCs that you have. And so we're so excited that we have Naomi from Jefferson County Public Schools with us today, because Naomi is going to share some examples of the district's racial equity policy that's going to come in a little bit, which allows for existing teams to be leveraged at the central office level within their community, but also in each school building, because the policy calls for teams to add to their racial equity plans items that lead to discussing race, racism, and important current events, and even integrating it into the curriculum as much as the curriculum allows for it. The second one is using current meeting structures, and we're still on the same slide, and I'm sorry, I'm unpacking them a little bit slow, but when moving as a team, it's helpful to use existing and consistent meeting structures, meeting agreements and expectations. And the guide provides several resources to support that. But we're thinking about, what are the regular agendas that you create, the structured agendas that you create, the regular times, the meeting roles. These structures can help the teams to be focused, but also help your teams to be effective while relying on past positive experiences that you've had in those structures. And then you want to situate the team's work within formal school and district improvement processes. Kent said this, Dr. McIntosh said this earlier when opening, the equity in the middle of the diagram that he showed for those who were there, that equity is not its own thing, it's embedded. So all of this work should be embedded within the current processes that you're engaging in. And so it needs to fit. And we want to make sure that people understand the context when they're doing that. JCPS also highlighted in their 3 pillars earlier. Naomi highlighted that the 3 pillars really are about culture and climate, racial equity, and the backpack success skills. And so if you'll recall that all of those 3 pillars are levers for their districts to be able to engage in discussing race, racism, and other important current events. So that was a really good example right away that she provided that you could leverage if you have those types of statements or vision statements that it sets you up to be able to do the work embedded within the systems. And they also have a racial equity policy that Naomi's going to talk about. And that racial policy, equity policy really is driven by data. So again, drawing from systems that are already there. There is a system-wide educational equity plan that they want all of their buildings to have, all of their offices within central office to have, and overall at the district level. So those are also examples of ways to embed this work into existing structures for teams. Now we're going to move on to talking about bringing others onto the team. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you so much. Now, even though we're leveraging, and we're saying in the guide is recommending to leverage existing teams, we also want to consider bringing others on the team. And the reason why is because we want to make sure we have people on the team that we can identify who's already committed to equity and possibly engaging in similar efforts. They can be advocates, or there can be allies that are interested in doing this work and have various roles who can join. So we want to think about that. We also want to think about expertise. We want to identify individuals with the needed expertise to have these conversations, to create the lesson planning, and to embed culturally responsive pedagogy within the practices and processes, and have the willingness to work collaboratively to enhance the equity, the capacity building that's going to be needed to do this work. And another and very important reason to bring others to the team is that we want to make sure that we're representing multiple and diverse lived experiences and perspectives. So by doing that, that ensures a likelihood of equity, but also these quality conversations where we're able to draw from different perspectives and widen our own understanding about the ways that people are experiencing the current events or just life within the school systems. So that's a really important piece. And we also want to make sure that the key roles include students and families, caregivers and parents, teachers, support staff, building leaders, district leaders, board members, cabinet leaders, so that we can have the representation. Because often we have diversity in role, but not necessarily the diversity for racial and ethnic identity. So we want to make sure we're including family members and community members and staff, especially if we have staff that is not representative of the marginalized student groups. And then we want to think about decision-making. With decision-making, the teams will need to access resources to influence to be able to fulfill the aims of the work in the group. And so we want to make sure there are people that are a part of the team that actually can access those resources, can reallocate resources, but also can make decisions so that the work can keep moving forward. So then the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are critically examining the systems in place, right? We've already talked about embedding this work in existing structures and leveraging existing teams and resources. Now we want to take time to critically examine the systems that are already in place. Although it is helpful to use existing systems, and we recommend that, it's also important to explore how those systems may perpetuate racial, ethnic inequities. So we want to be thoughtful about that. If educators want to address racial disparities, it's necessary to engage in explicit and ongoing conversations about race. We have to name it. We can't fix those things that we don't name. We can't address those things that we don't name. So we want to do that. So some ways to get at that is to review school policies and procedures and consider which student groups are benefiting most from the current systems and who are not. I always ask that question, who's benefiting from the way things are, for the ways that policies have been designed, and who's not? And really acting on those things as we hear them. And then making sure we're identifying the barriers that may be in place so that we can support the best implementation of these practices. We then want to assess representation. We talked about that, needing to have multiple and diverse perspectives and lived experiences. So school leaders can examine efforts by identifying not only who's on the team, but who has voice and agency. Because representation is not just about making sure that someone's there, that the diverse perspectives are present, but are their voices a part of that conversation and the decision-making in the agency? So we want to be thoughtful about that. And we want to ask, are they participating in ways that's meaningful for them? Because that becomes important as well. Specifically, as we think about our individuals from marginalized student groups. Then we want to assess team decision-making processes. This is important because we want to examine operating procedures for the team and other teams in the organization. There are going to be processes for soliciting and acting on input from marginalized voices. We want to make sure there's a commitment for shared authority and collaboration in decision-making. And then we want to make sure that this is being modeled for the broader organization. And then we want to assess the use of race-specific language. Teams can attend to this specific language that team members and stakeholders are using regarding race, and whether the language facilitates or inhibits improvement efforts. We want to make sure that we're having the conversations because school organizations are likely to reflect on the social structures from the dominant racial group. So we want to encourage members to openly and intentionally communicate knowledge that challenges the status quo. And then cultivate capacity. That's important too. Leaders committed to this work can and should work persistently to cultivate the capacity of self and of other group members. The guide offers a really nice resource called Build Knowledge and Experience, and it's a link that gives you a section in the actual guide that helps you to leverage it for increasing knowledge and skills in the different areas that you need to build that capacity. And then reviewing existing academic curriculum, curricula for bias and representation. Making sure we're examining school curriculum and imagery around the school to identify bias and representation that may exist. And then also where possible, it's really empowering for students to take action steps of examining the curriculum and also post-it materials. So that they can also share where the representation is or is lacking or is misrepresenting. And then partnering with families and administrators is the next area that we're going to talk about. And we want to do that by developing a plan that seeks agreement and institutional support. This is, again, going back to don't go it alone if possible, and building that support. So if there isn't a current policy, JCPS has amazing policies and structures that they're leveraging. So if there isn't policy enabling this work to support the district or the school leadership, you want to make sure that you are developing a plan for getting that support. Reaching out to people or groups in power can be intimidating, but you want to reach out and you want to make sure that you're leveraging data, narratives, making sure that you are providing a clear rationale for why there's a need to engage in the work. Sometimes the convincing piece can be hard, but if we're providing them with documentation and tailoring the rationale for why it's important, that really helps because then people can see some of the evidence of why, like these videos really are compelling and they serve as some data, right? Because you hear student voices and teacher voices and adult voices coming out in those videos. So you want to make sure you're doing that. You want to also use existing school data. And we want to make sure that we're using climate data. Dr. LaSalle just did a really strong session on looking at climate and data. So being able to look at that data, being able to disaggregate that data and show from different perspectives who's experiencing that. Naomi, again, is going to talk about the behavior data analysis protocol that their district uses. And it's an example of one type of data set that can be used. We don't just want to look at outcome data. We also want to look at system data that helps us to understand the conditions in which our students are learning and our teachers are teaching. And then we want to ask stakeholders to make sure that they're a part of this, the information that we're gathering, because the stories can increase commitment, right, and cultivate shared ownership. We also want to connect to existing districts and school goals and improvement plans, right? Because this becomes important when our stakeholders can see that this is highly connected to our curriculum, is connected to, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but to school improvement plan and processes, then that helps them to see that this is not something separate or isolated, but it's very critical to improvement and outcomes for students. How can students come in the classroom and learn, for an example, if they're coming off of something such as the Breonna Taylor, the decisions that were made, the murder, the death of that, and then not talk about that and expect for students to be able to engage in learning. So a lot of these things need to be embedded in the school improvement processes, but also in the curriculum for having conversations. You know, one of the teachers talked about putting the content to the side, and sometimes you just have to do that. But you also can look for ways to integrate these conversations into the content, because often the curriculum have those different opportunities to be able to do so. And then by sharing that with stakeholders, that helps them to see this is not separate from the work that we're already engaging in. We want to also proactively communicate with families. We want to make sure that the communication is clear. We do it early, is ongoing, because this helps us not to have missteps, and it can mitigate potential negative reactions when everyone is aware of what's going on in the direction that it's going in. And then consider creating web pages and resources so that different people can access these resources. It may not reach all stakeholders, but it allows for visitors to be able to access these resources on their own time and differentiate in terms of what individuals are needing to access. If you have district plans and lesson plans or developed resources, those can also be posted. We want to also anticipate educators' discomfort and plan proactively. We want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about the process and how the process can impact the outcomes. And so just really quickly, some of the levers that JCPS has shared comes from their Teaching for Equity framework. So pay close attention as Naomi's talking through that. because in that framework, they already have these systems that allow for teachers to and teams to align this work to some of their district level work mandates and resources.
Every member of our school district knows that racial equity is a key pillar to our work. So one way to embed this work into existing systems is by petitioning your school board or your local school to create policy that reflects the work that is important to all. So for us, since racial equity is a core component of the work we do in JCPS, our board voted to adopt a racial equity policy in May of 2018. For us, it was a monumental step for our district to just take a hard stance on some of the longstanding inequities that we were a part of delivering to students and families. So we're still working to address these issues, and because we know that there's no quick fix when it comes to racial equity. So let me be clear. The adoption of our policy and most of the work that I'll share today was created well before the race guide was published just a few months ago. But our work in JCPS really has been a multi-year process, and it will be for you, because as we know, with any initiative, nothing happens overnight. So our racial equity policy is a public commitment by our school board to actively work to eliminate those institutional and structural policies and practices that create and perpetuate inequities among racial groups. Our goal is to reduce disproportional access and disproportional outcomes. So this racial equity policy resource book goes in depth on how we're doing this work. It includes our collective why we think racial equity should be a priority, and there are several resources that I'll discuss later in the presentation. So again, the blue link, you should be able to download this resource.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And so the next part of the process is really around building knowledge and experience. And so let's talk about that a little bit. There are two areas that we in the actual guide recommends, and that is areas for learning and then guidance for moving self-reflection into action. So let's go to the next slide and talk about areas for learning. So ongoing critical self-reflection is necessary for engaging students and embracing diversity and fostering belongings in the classroom. The process should be and is ongoing. It cannot be obtained in an instant. And that's taking us back to the opening keynote right this morning, where the conversation was around there are no quick fixes. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about how do we sustain this work over time. And so one of the ways to increase the likelihood of implementing this work and sustaining it over time really is around engaging and learning, because the more we can learn to prepare ourselves to support students in a conversation, the more we can increase our confidence to have these conversations. So some of the areas that we want to make sure we're focusing on is we want to make sure that we are learning about our history of systemic racism in our country. I know that it's a really difficult time right now in our society, and there's a struggle, and there are ways in which this work sometimes feel like it's being silenced, but we have to learn about it. It is our history and it is a reality. And the more we can understand it, we can understand how that is impacting the experiences that we all are seeing and having in different ways today. We want to explore privilege, because with our identities and the different ways in which we show up in our workspaces and in our lives, we carry multiple points of privilege, multiple points of marginalization, or a combination of both. And how does that impact the spaces that we're in, the conversations that we're having, and the ways in which systems are set up to benefit some but not others? We also want to make sure we're understanding bias. We want to understand how bias impacts our decision making, and how bias impacts the way that schools are set up, structures are set up, society is set up. So the more that we understand bias and how it impacts experiences of students and families that have been historically marginalized, we can better support conversations. And again, with identity development, we want to make sure we're not only understanding identity development, but understanding intersections of identities and how multiple points of oppression can be occurring for different individuals, and how that impacts their learning and their ability to be able to show up and do their best and be their best. We want to make sure we're engaging in ongoing learning around cultural awareness. I believe it's Dr. Latson Billings who says one way to work on being culturally proficient is to be proficient in at least 2 different cultures. And so how are we becoming aware of the cultures that are in our communities in which our schools are situated, and how does that impact the ways in which we support this work? And then also social justice, right? How do we understand ways in which social justice impacts the work that we're engaging in? We know that if we're thinking about culturally responsive and sustaining practices, that work is really about social justice. And of course, centering equity in our work is about social justice. Pages 15 through 18 on the guide provides activities intended for adults and for teens to complete individually. As a team first, before working with staff, and then with staff, so that all can feel and be more prepared for facilitating these conversations and this work with others. Some may be completed with students as well, but most of the activities are within the lessons in the Appendix F, and there's also a more extensive list in Appendix H. And then the second thing is, now that we've been engaging in learning, which should be going ongoing, we want to also think about the reflection that we're engaged, because if we're engaging in that type of learning, we're also engaging in, or should be engaging in, self-reflection. But we can't stop there. We have to also think about how are we going to act on the things that we're thinking about. So when we think about that, we want to have questions that we can ask ourselves to help us not only reflect, but move into action. So some questions that could be helpful: how has my learning changed my thinking, my beliefs, and my values? This is really important, because as we learn, as Maya Angelou says, we know better, we do better. So how is what I'm learning changing my thinking, my beliefs, and my values? And this is important because we are all socially conditioned from birth. And so we have to be aware of ways in which we've been conditioned to think, believe, and behave. And then we need to be thinking about how do we shift those types of things. We want to ask, how do I view myself? I can tell you, I've been asking questions such as these my entire life. I can go back to elementary school. I was asking questions such as this. And how is that changing over time based on what I know? How do I view people from racial and diverse backgrounds? That becomes really important too, because we're not always aware how we've been conditioned to think about different people, or people who have different lived experiences or racial backgrounds and other diverse backgrounds. So we need to be thinking about that and challenging ourselves to push beyond our comfort levels with how we've traditionally thought and where we are now. How confident am I on a scale from 1 to 5? And talking about racism with students, especially as I'm engaging in the learning and we're putting these systems, preparing to put these systems in place. What might be the reasons for having less confidence? Is it because of a need for more information on a particular topic? And there is a tool called the Learning for Justice tool, Let's Talk Guide, that can help you think about what and explore why you may have less confidence if you're saying you're a 1 or you're a 2. And that's also a link that's in the guide. It can be really productive to uncover specific areas of discomfort and then collect resources to feel more prepared as you're engaging in the work. You can also ask, how am I acting on what I've been learning? Because now we're thinking, we can't just hear it. I always tell my colleagues and even my boss, I can't unknow what I know. And so that is just something that, changes how you act when you're learning different things. And so how am I acting on what I've been learning? Sometimes people think you have to do a lot of large steps, but sometimes it's the smaller steps that add up and create those ripple effects to larger things. And then how can I use what I'm learning to support my students in discussing race? And so that becomes an important question as well. So those are some guidance for moving from self-reflection to action.
So part of building knowledge and experience is to use frameworks that focus on equity and help teachers embed this work into their daily instruction. I love this Teaching for Equity framework because it not only shows the teacher dispositions, it also gives examples of what this work should look like, sound like, and feel like in a school. So in order to build knowledge and experience, we must understand how curriculum and delivery of instruction affects students and outcomes. So if you look at component 1, it focuses on MTSS, that emphasizes academic, social emotional learning, but it also includes anti-racism supports. For component 2, it focuses on college and career readiness standards as a component of equity. For component 3, it addresses culture and identities. Component 4 focuses on access to grade level standards and appropriate scaffolds. And component 5 states that students should have voice and choice in their learning, and that is really key. And again, the link is at the bottom of this slide. So another thing that I love about this resource that was created for teachers by teachers is that it doesn't just leave you hanging with ethereal concepts. It takes a deeper dive by giving you content-specific resources for ELA and for math. So I encourage you to take a look at this framework and really think about adopting a framework just like this one, because that's a great entry point and a place to start when you're thinking about racial equity. Understanding and analyzing data is a huge component of building knowledge and experience. We know that racial equity is more than just curriculum. It's also in our behavioral practices and our policies. So to address equity and disproportionality in our district, every principal was introduced to the behavior data analysis protocol at the beginning of the school year. The goal is to have the district and school staff commit to analyzing their data and create action plans to follow through on reducing disproportionality in how we handle discipline. So we know that students of color are suspended disproportionately more than their white counterparts. So we started at the district level by asking the supervisors of the principals to look at their schools by group and do a root cause analysis to prioritize urgency and need. Next, we required principals to lead their school leadership teams in a root cause analysis to understand their data from previous years so that they can figure out where they can improve. What's really neat about this plan is every school administrator had to create a suspension reduction plan. It's an action plan that's tied to their evaluation and will be reviewed monthly and revised at the school level and looked at biannually by their supervisors. So we're still in the process of implementing this procedure, but we know that with this level of accountability, we can positively affect data and, most importantly, outcomes for students. So this next slide just shows you the behavior data school profile that we gave to the schools. And so in our district, we do have a district data and research team that can produce these types of reports. But just know that there are other systems out there like Swiss or FastBridge that if you subscribe to those, they can help you with the data analysis. Our goal was to give them the data so that they could go beyond analysis and go into analyzing their practices to make positive change. And we know that schools typically want resources and training that will help their teachers develop better instructional and behavioral strategies to increase engagement in the classroom and improve academic outcomes. So it's important for us to not just say, here is the problem, you fix it, but show how we have district level resources that can be used to support the schools. So what you see is a targeted menu of trainings that we'd already developed. And we shared this menu with schools so they could know where to start on their journey to reduce disproportionality. Again, the goal was to build knowledge and experience through existing resources. And the link will take you to some of those trainings.
So I'm going to talk about considerations for like the installation plan and for rolling out the process. So I thought about it in phases, right? So the first part is initial team planning, really being intentional about your objectives and your outcomes that you want to accomplish. And I think that that's really, really important because you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page and you want to make sure that you know what you're aiming for so that when you go back and evaluate, you have a metric that you can reflect on. Then build capacity. So lead teachers, district and school staff and stakeholders through the work. And so oftentimes we start with a smaller team that initiates the work and creates the objectives. And it's important then to build capacity across the district for a couple of reasons. One, we know that turnover is often an issue. And so you don't want it to be reliant on one or two people. And then if they leave, then everything goes out the door with them. So you want to build capacity. Two, we know how important buy-in is. And so instead of feeling like it's top down, well, it has to be top down in order for it to work. So there's that caveat, but top down in terms of being instructive, you want it to be collaborative. And so as you start to strengthen your team, you want to build capacity and also get feedback. And one of the things that we point out throughout the guide, as Ruthie mentioned earlier, this is really straight from the guide because we wanted to make sure that the information is consistent and explicit. But it's important to include student voice and student feedback. Naomi showed a beautiful example of students talking about their experiences and talking about what it feels like when people ask them about things that are going on or don't ask them about things that are going on. And so getting student feedback is really valuable. I mean, as young as elementary school, we could be doing this, right? And part of what we talk about and give examples of in the guide is how to talk about things like race within a developmentally appropriate framework. But we know that it can be and should be done starting in elementary school. And then you go into the full rollout, which will be dependent right on your objectives and your outcomes. And then the other piece is it's an iterative process. So you're constantly getting feedback and improving the process. And Naomi talked about this, right? They've been doing this for a few years, but you're constantly going back and revising. We're saying what worked really well, what didn't work so well, what do we need to add, what do we need to modify? What, I think the biggest takeaway is we all, you come up with this plan and you're like, okay, we're going to go forward, but don't be afraid to look back and say, is it working? And to modify things that need to be modified based on feedback from a number of stakeholders. Next. The next thing is there are these certain pillars. So there are about 5 here, I think, and then a couple more. So one of them is developing the purpose and expected outcomes, which I talked about. Provide a common language and definition of key terms. So even within the guide, we have a glossary of key terms. When we're talking about equity, when we're talking about equality, who are we talking about? And this guide, we focus specifically on race and having conversations about race, and had intentional conversations about, are we talking about race more broadly? Are we talking about race, disabilities, and gender identity? And so we were really intentional about what is the purpose of this guide and to have common language so that when we're having these conversations, we know that we're talking, literally speaking the same language. Consider the historical context. I mentioned this a little bit later, but consider the historical context of race within the community, right? So when Naomi says, we're home of Muhammad Ali, it was Muhammad Ali, right, Naomi? Yes. But also Breonna Taylor, right? I mean, there are multiple sides of history. And it's important to acknowledge, right, that there are certain things within our communities that we celebrate, and there are certain things within our communities that we don't celebrate. And we can't only talk about the glory part of it, right? And so it's important to understand the historical context, because having conversations about race with students who are directly impacted by racial trauma can, looks different depending on where you're at. I should also note here that having conversations about race with students are equally important, whether they are directly or indirectly affected by racial trauma, right? Because what we know about trauma is that someone doesn't have to actually experience it to experience trauma as a result of it. And so that's why it's important, no matter what context, to be having these conversations. Establish community agreements. I think in communities that do this really well, you have different entities involved. You have your school board. I think Naomi mentioned that. You have your school board involved. You have school committee involved. You have community organizations involved. You want there to be continuity and congruity with what's going on within the community, and not to feel like it's siloed or not to feel like there are competing interests. And that's where the key terms comes in again. So we're talking the same language and we have the same goals. And then plan to provide emotional instructional support for staff. Identify emotional or safety needs for staff. When will people be uncomfortable? When, how do we create a safe environment? One of the things I think is so important to relate is when I'm talking about race, it's very likely that you're going to be uncomfortable, right? And some of us, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. What is a non-negotiable for me is for people to feel unsafe. Right. And so it's really important that people feel safe to share their opinions, whether people agree or not, but you're going to be uncomfortable because it's not often that we have these conversations. And to what was reflected in the video earlier is different students are going to feel comfortable having conversations with different people at different times, and we have to be able to honor that and provide support for colleagues. The caveat to that is also to recognize, like, what support are we providing to colleagues, right? We have to make sure that we're attentive or aware of fragility and aware of bias when it comes to supporting faculty, so that it doesn't inhibit us from moving forward with original goals and objectives that you set forth to meet your outcomes. Next, a couple other considerations. You skipped a slide. Oh, yeah. No, can you go back one? Sorry. Yes, sorry. So for the rollout process, the other piece is, so there's this pilot phase that I think is important. And usually that's where we implement with small groups. And then we are able to revise and adapt. So sometimes you have students that are really eager to participate and really eager to move forward. And so, like with the curriculum, we might use the curriculum with a smaller group of students and get feedback and see where we need to pivot, see where we need to modify. And then from that, we're able to start to expand as we're building capacity. So these things are happening concurrently. So as we're building capacity to larger groups. The use of affinity groups, I think, is increasingly common. So in addition to whole groups, you have to be aware of the unique needs or supports that individuals with shared characteristics have, right? And so think about within Naomi's district, right? So you have Black students who might be having conversations. The students talked about the last period of the day, the teacher was having conversations about things that were happening. That Black student might also need smaller group support, right? Depending on how she's affected by these events, right? So sometimes we have larger groups, but it's important to create safe and private spaces for people who need additional support, or just to be able to talk about the shared experience, right? With people who can relate and people who can understand them, right? So there's two arms of it, right? The greater good and talking about it with the larger community, but also recognizing that you want to have these safe spaces for students who are Black and experiencing racial trauma, right? And thinking about what that looks like and allowing them to lead the process. Additional resources. I think that it is helpful, to the extent possible, to provide lesson plans and additional resources to support rollout. If I go into a school and I say, okay, this week we're all going to talk about George Floyd, or this week we're all going to talk about implicit bias, that can go a whole lot of right ways and a whole lot of wrong ways, right? We have a lot of well-intentioned people causing harm. And so I think that if you want things to be somewhat on the same page, it's helpful to have lesson plans. What are the key points that you want to address? What are the key resources that you want to use? How do you facilitate guiding questions? And also what's in the guidance, what do you do when you have difficult questions, right? Or what do you do when you have people trying to disrupt the process? How do you monitor that within the classroom? And so I think providing resources becomes really, really valuable, and also continuing to get feedback. And then lastly, develop district-wide a schedule for rolling things out. So along with creating objectives, the schedule helps so that you have an organizational structure. If you're doing PD, then you can look at the district calendar and say, when is everyone getting this PD? If you're talking about addressing certain topics across certain months and you have lesson plans, then you can do that strategically. I mean, it kind of varies based on how school's readiness to implement, because that's gonna vary depending on capacity. But thinking about how you look at it from the bigger picture and then go small. And then lastly, just like I said earlier, establish an iterative process for ongoing support, revisions, and additions based on feedback and community needs. I mean, we all have great ideas and are well-intentioned, but we have to make sure to go back and be reflective, not just about, how we feel, but how other people feel about the process and how it's benefiting them.
So part of the installation process is to start with a small group of dedicated folks who can come up with a plan that can be shared to a larger audience. You heard Dr. LaSalle talk about that. At the district level and in each school, we have racial equity committees. Each school committee is made up of both certified, classified staff, students, parents, It's important for everyone to have a voice and be represented when it comes to equity, specifically racial equity. Even if you don't have a district that has adopted a racial equity policy, you can still start by creating school-wide committees that can focus on local policies and practices that relate to racial equity. Or you can leverage this work through an existing team. That's really important. You don't have to start from scratch. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about some of these resources that I've included in the guide. We're running short on time. I knew this would happen because I had so many things that I wanted to share with you all, and I included it all in the presentation. There are lots of links. So we have a district, a public-facing accountability website that shows our district and school level data and several components that affect equity in schools. So the goal of this equity scorecard is to raise awareness about equity and access within JCPS and to provide evidence to support institutional change with a higher level of accountability. This scorecard, you heard me say it's public facing. That means that anyone, even you, could go in and look at our data. So a parent can go in and look at our data, a community member, people from all over the world, because we want our data to be our level of accountability. For the next slide, we also not only show district level data, we show school level data in our scorecard. And what does this mean? It means that, again, as a parent, I can go in and see my school level data. As a community member, I can go in and see my school level data. For us, equity is about access, and access is accountability. So part of the planning process is leveraging available resources and knowing the correct questions that I ask. So our DEP team created reflection guides to help schools understand their role in this racial equity work. This guide really does have great questions to help educators to really think through their practices and start to determine areas for growth that might need to be included in the school plan. So I would emphasize using the race guide that we're referring to today, as well as something like these types of guiding questions. Those are really great places to start with your equity work. So I'm going to really quickly talk about the R tool. We should be taking questions right now, but I'm not sure, colleagues, what we want to do. Let me talk about this and then we can decide. So this is a really neat resource because we know that curriculum and instruction are critical elements to consider when thinking about creating an installation plan. So our JCPS DEP team created the Affirming Racial Equity tool, or the R tool. And this tool is a way for school staff to incorporate more racially equitable practices into curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy. And the links are there on this slide. There are 6 components of the R tool, and they range from content integration to classroom culture. And the teachers use these 6 components as part of their lesson planning process during their professional learning communities, or PLCs, and during content delivery to students. All 6 components work together to really challenge teachers to be more equitable before, during, and after instruction happens.
So I'm just going to address this really briefly so that we can move on to questions. Again, this information is in the guide, but it is important to still address how do we implement and monitor progress. And so one of the ways that I think, right, is, or it should be our default, is leverage your framework and school-wide expectations. So teaching and modeling expectations, but allow room for flexibility. That includes, what does it mean to be respectful when you engage in conversations? How do you have open dialogue? How do you create safe environments for students to be able to ask even uncomfortable questions? Recognize racial justice advocacy and allyship in your classroom, right? Provide space and opportunities for students to feel acknowledged for expressing how they feel and to be having difficult conversations. Allow for that space, just like we recognize for students who are kind and demonstrate nice behaviors to other students, we can recognize them for sharing tough feelings and having and engaging in tough conversations. Accept and proceed throughout the initial discomfort. It's gonna be uncomfortable. You know, I'd be remiss if I said that I wasn't going to be. It's going to be uncomfortable. But if you create a safe environment for people to support one another, then you can work through that. And that's where the power happens, right? That's where the change happens, is working through that. But being able to have those conversations, because you have shared objectives, you have shared outcomes, and that's what you have to keep in mind. And then the other piece is be a facilitator, right? So kids aren't looking for us to be an instructor, right? And to just tell them things. We want to be able to facilitate the conversation, allow them to construct knowledge, right? It's not lecturing, allow them to construct knowledge and to own the process. So I rarely will say, well, I feel like this, or I think this. If someone asks a question, I'll say, well, what do other people think about that? How do other people feel about that? Tell me more about what you're thinking. What makes you feel like that? You know, so keep it open-ended, because oftentimes we'll insert our opinions and then it shuts down the students in the process. And so just be aware of that process. I'll go through this really briefly, mostly the avoids, right? So avoid colorblind ideologies, right? That has gotten us nowhere. And so being colorblind is not the ideal. Stay out of deficit thinking. Think about strengths-based perspectives. Students who come from, no matter what community they come from, they have strengths, and how do you use that to help them build interpersonal skills, coping strategies, and to engage in conversation. Avoid all lives matter. Last year I did a presentation on why Black Lives Matter, and so you can reflect on that if you have questions. And be careful about white savior syndrome and thinking about, like, how do you support students without, you know, how do you support students authentically and genuinely without it being about us, without it being about what I think I'm doing? How do I make sure I'm there for them? And don't single students out, especially when they represent a smaller group of students. And so I'll stop there. Like I said, everything definitely is in the guide. You can always follow up with us when you need to. And after you do all that, extend and expand the work. Keep going, and having these conversations with minoritized and marginalized students. I'll stop there.
So I have quite a few other things that is included in the PowerPoint. If you're have any questions, feel free to reach out. We'll take questions now, just because I want to make sure that we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Naomi. So just wanted to let you know the rest of this are the examples that Naomi has from Jefferson County. And then we had a little bit of information about the appendices and some additional resources from Naomi. It looks like we have 2 questions in the chat box. So I'm going to read them, and then hopefully we'll have one of us jump in and answer it real quick. So the first question is, I'm curious what advocacy tips, strategies you might offer for a local ISD PBIS department to offer racial equity and bias professional development. Right now, we only have access to PB being covered that is delivered by the PBIS team and not the Culture, Climate, and Equity department.
I can start really quickly and saying your PBIS team doesn't have to be separate from your Culture, Climate, and Equity department, right? And so that's my first thought, is that they don't have to be separate, because, right, if we implement PBIS in a multi-tiered framework in the way that we're supposed to, then it will address equity. And so if we have PBIS working over here and Culture, Climate, and Equity working over here, essentially, right, hopefully you're working towards the same goal, but you're doing it in silos. And so if you come together and think about, what does it mean to address equity within a framework, right? What is it that all students in your school need? Even professional development, what are some basic, what are not basic, what are some foundational professional development topics that we should be addressing, right? Racial equity, equality versus equity, inclusion, implicit bias. I mean, those are some of the foundational things. And we see that they tie directly to Pbis, right? Implicit bias and disproportionality and vulnerable decision points, and thinking about setting expectations and norms, which means you have to consider the cultural and contextual considerations of students. And so the first thing is to like remove that wedge between the two committees and come together, because within that framework, you can address culture, climate, and equity. In fact, within that framework, by default, you should be addressing those things. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. LaSalle. I'll jump in really quickly with that question. I'm not sure if ISDs where you are the same as they are here in Michigan, but I know here ISDs have access to regional data. So they have access to looking at outcomes for systems in terms of what's been implemented, but also outcomes for students. So being able to develop a rationale around the data that may be telling its own story about what is needed is also another way to have that conversation. But I completely agree with Dr. LaSalle, because I think that would also help to move the work forward and sustain it over time.
I will add that the guide is your first step. Because there are lots of resources in the guide, there are lots of resources in this presentation that can give you access to PD that was been created by people who are living experts. So definitely start with the guide, because it's huge. If you haven't seen it, it's a lot of resources. This is the guide. So please download it and use it.
Thanks, Naomi. I really don't have anything additional to add. I would completely agree with what the others said about ways to start with that as a district. The second question that we have that Kent has put in the chat box for us is, what would you suggest as a first step for an existing team to start this work in an elementary school in a very racially and culturally diverse neighborhood? I'm going to piggyback off a little bit of what Naomi just said. The first thing is in the guide is to identify that existing team, which you already have. From there, I would recommend looking at the guide and looking about knowledges and experiences and see if that's something that you need to increase in all team members first. As Dr. LaSalle mentioned earlier, there are terms and definitions in the back, and that might be a good place to start as well to make sure that everybody on the team is on the same page with those definitions. So that would be my recommendations for the first starts.
I can add from my school climate genes is, you can start by collecting data around school climate from the families, from students, and from teachers. And what you can do is look at that at the overall level, but then disaggregate the data. So you have a really diverse community. So disaggregate the data and see how students are feeling and how that compares across groups. And you can start to look at that from a strengths-based perspective. What are the things that we're doing really well? Where are the areas that we struggle? Are there certain groups who are having more negative experiences than others? And the same for the families, and being able to collect data from them. And so that's a way to start to have data and to be able to identify some really specific areas. It could be something seemingly small, like finding an adult that all students can connect with, or it could be making sure that students feel safe in school. But that's just one way to start that is relatively low stakes, but has a high yield.
What I love about your example, Dr. LaSalle, is that you're going right back to the guide. So again, Naomi, I appreciate your recommendations to start with the guide, because you're embedding this work into existing systems when you do that. And so again, I think that the guide will also give you more depth to some of these really good questions that are all of them are really good questions that are being asked. But again, you have access to data from your systems that tells a story, and being able to connect that, starting this work to the guide and to the data that's telling a story about your systems is a really helpful way to start this work.
I'll add in making sure that all stakeholders are represented. So often meaningful adults forget to include students or families. And so making sure that everyone who will be affected has a voice and has choice. So just making sure that whichever committee or whichever team is working on this, that you have a wide representation.
And I'll just add two things on top of that too, as Dr. Sal was saying about climate. We know that a lot of states, a lot of districts have adopted school climate surveys, but if your school does not have one that has been adopted, there are some ones that are out there in recommendations. And I know Kent McIntosh had shared one in our last session, so you might want to put that in the chat box. The other thing I will say is there is a whole strand coming up on voice, including voice in your session. So if that's something that you're looking at, how do we practically include youth voice and student voice into our systems? There's some sessions on that can give you some of those examples. And with that, we are quickly at the warning time. So I just wanted to note that on the screen now is the information for the evaluation for this session. You'll have a couple different opportunities to evaluate the session. There is the QR code here if you want to do that real quickly and get it done and over with. I also know that the forum is sending out those evaluations as well. They really do use the information, the evaluation for planning for the next year's session. And even the greatest thing, if you complete it, there's a link to enter for a gift card raffle. And those are wonderful as well.
I just want to add, for the person who put in the poll to access the behavior data analysis protocol resources, if you email me, then I can send you some things. I didn't include all of those links in the PowerPoint, but I'm happy to share.
Again, this PowerPoint is in the Pbis, so you'll have access to all of our email addresses. It's also here if you want to take a quick picture real quick before you go back. I just want to make sure we go back in case people didn't get the chance to take a picture of the QR code yet, to go back to that slide. I know we have about probably 30 seconds left before we're going to get kicked out. Any last questions? And I just want to say thank you so much for all the presenters today. And I really want to give a big shout out to Naomi and to Jefferson Public Schools because of all the wonderful work that they're doing and that they're willing to share that information with all of us and willing to share all of those resources. I know there's a wealth of them and she's a wealth of knowledge. So thank you, Naomi.
Happy to be here and happy to be a part of this work. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Ivan, for being our host. Thank you, Kent, for doing the tech work and doing the chat polls for us. We greatly appreciate it.
Yes, thank you guys so much.
Yes,
And thank you so much, Naomi.
Yes, thank you, Naomi.